Welcome to the Ethics and Technology webinar. Presenting today, we are joined by Brian Friedrich and Greg Dissearle. Brian became a member of the IESBA in 2018. He chairs the board's Technology Working Group and E-Code Advisory Group and is a member of the Planning Committee and the Technology Task Force. Brian is a principal in a research standards and technology consultancy firm that has shaped his work experience for over 20 years. Greg is a partner in Risk Management Independence Group at KPMG LLP in the United States. In this role, Greg has responsibilities related to ethics and independence for KPMG US and participates in KPMG's International Global Independence Group. Before I hand it over to our presenters, I would also like to acknowledge that we are joined by CPA Australia's board directors, Dale Pinto, Rick Del Santi, and Rosemary Sinclair. Thank you for joining us. Okay, on that note, I'm just going to go ahead and welcome Brian into the conversation. First, Brian, just opening up your mic. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, and good morning, Linda.
Excellent. Hi, Brian. I've just handed that control over to you. Enjoy the webinar, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm Brian Friedrich, and my colleague Greg and I are going to spend the next hour or so with you discussing the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, or the IESBA's Technology Initiative, and also more broadly some considerations about the impact that emerging technology is having or is expected to have on the behavior of professional accountants. Okay, so here's our agenda for the session today. We'll begin our presentation with a bit of context for how the examination of technology fits within the larger ethical imperative of the profession and how ethics standards fit into that picture. And then we'll run through the key areas for consideration that the IESBA is focused on with respect to the intersection between ethics and technology based on earlier research and outreach that we've done and are continuing to do. And we've structured our presentation on those focus areas based on how they're being addressed by the IESBA. So in other words, based on what the task force is doing and what the working group is doing. And then we'll close by responding to a few questions from you folks. And as we progress through, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Greg and I will look forward to answering some of those as time permits toward the end. And otherwise, your questions and comments will also be collected for us to review following the session, and hopefully then also be able to respond to in an attachment together with the slide deck that will be sent to you. There we go. Okay, so just before we dive into the issues, we thought that it'd be valuable just to take a few moments and ensure that everyone has an understanding of what the IESBA is, so the context and approach that we're sharing today makes sense to everyone. It's a large group with us here today, and so we know that not everyone is going to be dialed in and following our board's work. So IESBA is an independent standard-setting board supported by IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. And that develops high-quality standards related to ethics and independence of professional accountants around the world. And the standards themselves are titled the International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants, including the International Independence Standards. And obviously, that's a bit too much of a mouthful to say every time, so typically we just end up referring to it as the IESBA Code, or in our particular context, the Code. In addition to developing the standards, the IESBA also supports adoption and implementation of the code through the development of resources to help professional accountancy organizations, so like CPA Australia, for example, as well as for individual firms and members to understand and help meet their ethics obligations. So of course, in Australia, you know the IESBA code indirectly because the APES 110 code is based on the IESBA code with a few additional paragraphs that are specific to your jurisdiction. You're also in good company because as of the summer of last year, more than 80 of the 134 IFAC member body jurisdictions have either already adopted or have made plans and commitments to adopt the IESBA code, and also the international network of firms called the Forum of Firms also uses policies that reflect the code for their conduct on transnational audits. So all the board's deliberations and papers, they're publicly available. Anyone can register to observe our meetings. They've had an increasing uptake, and now that they're available for virtual attendance as well over the past year and a bit, as many things are. The IESBA also does frequent outreach with key stakeholders to gain insights and to hear a wide variety of views from interested parties on our different projects as they move forward. We also issue exposure drafts, new pronouncements, and so on. As they go through the pipeline, again, they're open for comment. The IESBA also does a number of different components of work around transparency and availability. So putting our work out there, all in the intention of helping to foster international debate on ethics issues that are faced by the profession and how collectively we should address them. Okay, so then how does the IESBA code, and by extension your own code, how do they fit into the bigger context of the profession? Ultimately, it's a matter of trust. As professional accountants, we all have a responsibility to protect the public and to prioritize the public interest. That's a long-standing expectation. So, of course, we also try to strive to add value in whatever each of us does in their individual roles. But we can't do that unless we have society's trust, and we can't earn and maintain trust unless we're seen to be committed to ethical behavior at our core. And when we talk about the value that we bring and what we're trusted to do, it's well understood that a strong application of ethics provisions supports financial and non-financial reporting initiatives, but it goes beyond just reporting. And more, CPAs are turned to help navigate broader challenges in organizations, again, because clients and employers trust our judgment, our competence, and our character. And our value as leaders becomes even more apparent during times of transformational change, such as now. Disruption of the accounting profession is accelerated by major developments in technology and by recent events such as the pandemic and the increased focus around the world on critical challenges, things like climate change, the pursuit of social justice and equity. And in times of these change, expectations of ethical behavior and decision-making becomes heightened, and professional accountants gain an advantage by having a solid code of ethics to help guide judgments and behaviors. So the IESBA code provides that strong base for professional accountants, but it's important that the IESBA code is also dynamic as technological and societal changes unfold at a fairly breakneck speed. The way that the code keeps up with change is through ongoing projects like the Technology Initiative, as well as IESBA's general approach to standard setting that favors focusing on principles rather than being highly rules-based. Okay, next slide, and over to Greg.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning, everyone, from the metro New York City area in the United States, where I'm watching the sunset out my window as you're watching it rise outside your windows. So, yes, we're going to wrap up this section, this introductory section on IESBA, continuing on the thought that Brian had there, that the IESBA code is dynamic and continues to address and evolve as the environment changes. And as we have here on the slide, here's a list of 4 or 5 recent and upcoming changes to the code that have been issued through new IESBA standards. And taking them one at a time, briefly talking about what each of them entails. We'll start with the first bullet, where in January 2020, IESBA issued a revision to Part 4B of the code, which covers independent standards related to assurance engagements other than audits and review engagements. This standard was mainly an update of Part 4B for revisions to the corresponding international standard on assurance engagements 3000, ISAE 3000 revised, issued by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, or the IAASB, as you'll hear us referred to throughout the session. That ISA 3000 standard addressing assurance engagements other than audits. So essentially a technical revision to the IESBA code to track the changes to similar topic material that was made in ISA E3000 revised. In October 2020, IESBA issued revisions to the code to better promote the role and mindset expected of all professional accountants, given the role the accountancy profession plays in society and the profession's responsibility to act in the public interest. In January 2021, revisions to the code that provide guidance for considering the objectivity of an engagement quality reviewer were issued. These revisions dovetail with the IAASB's International Standard on Quality Management 2, or ISQM2, on engagement quality reviews. And then lastly, IESBA's most recently issued revisions to the independent standards of the code related to non-assurance services and fees. As indicated here on the slide, the non-assurance services revisions create more restrictive requirements on the provision of non-assurance services by audit firms to their audit clients, and in particular clients that are public interest entities. And the fees revisions strengthen fee-related independence provisions, including adding more fulsome disclosure requirements related to fees charged for services by audit firms delivered to its audit clients. So that wraps up a little bit of background on IESBA, and I will say one more thing. You do see the click here if you want to access any of those new pronouncements. So with the materials, you can click there and you will be guided to those standards that I just referenced. So I think that wraps up our background on IESBA to kind of set the stage for where we're going with the technology project. So Brian, with that, I'll hand it back over to you.
Sounds perfect, Greg. Yeah, so we'll just give you a little bit of background now about the history of the IESBA Technology Initiative, again, for some context when we talk about our approach and structure moving on. Okay, so here's a look at where we've been and where we're going. There is a fair amount of detail here, but just want to touch on a few of the key points. So the Technology Initiative began in 2018, and at that time, it was given high priority within our 2019 to 2023 strategic work plan. Initially, the board determined that the initiative should take a systematic or phased approach to its work, really trying to bundle emerging or disruptive technologies into key themes, so things like AI and blockchain, cybersecurity, and so on, and investigating each of those themes in turn. And so we started our work with a deep dive into AI and robotic process automation, as well as more generally on the use of data and data analytics. And that resulted at the end of 2019 in a Phase 1 final report that produced 7 key areas of recommendations. And these recommendations relate to areas of the code that might benefit from enhancements, and they continue to guide our work to this day. Also along the path, 2 significant changes in workflow ended up emerging. The first is that we realized early on that these emerging technologies can't really be looked at in silos. And the second is that it's beneficial to consider potential changes to the code itself while also working on developing broader guidance to professional accountants in the form of non-authoritative materials. So in other words, as much as we as a board need to determine how the code could be enhanced in light of technological changes, there's also a significant demand from stakeholders, whether they're professional bodies or firms or individual members, to have tools that help them navigate ethics challenges that arise when developing and implementing technology. So earlier in this year, the initiative was split into a task force and a working group to more holistically cover off these different but clearly connected roles. Okay, so just a few words about that holistic approach that's used by our parallel teams, the task force and the working group. That 2019 working group Phase 1 report had the 7 recommendations that were related to potential code changes, but also in the report we had recommended developing non-authoritative materials to help CPAs apply the code in the context of the digital era where emerging tech is becoming ever more prevalent. So the 2 work streams reflect that need for both initiatives to be progressed concurrently and for the broader set of technologies to be considered at the same time as developing new code enhancements. So the way the responsibilities have been divided, the working group is focused on developing non-authoritative materials, and to do that, we're also collaborating with other organizations, so other professional bodies. The working group is also continuing to do research and outreach to get a better perspective on the broader set of technologies, particularly through actual and predictable use cases, and those findings then get fed back into the work of the task force. The task force, meanwhile, continues to advance its work to develop tech-related code revisions, which it expects will be ready for public exposure at the end of this year. And as is always the case with the IESBA, it's pursuing those proposed changes in a principle-based manner to avoid drafting proposals that end up being too narrow or too specific to a particular technology, given that we all know that technology will continue to evolve. So a principles-based approach is what helps to future-proof the code, to keep it relevant, to keep it fit for purpose as the landscape keeps shifting. Okay, so that's how the two work streams have been fashioned, and we'll turn next to an overview of the topic areas that have emerged as important to be dealt with by the profession, and I'm going to turn back over to Greg for that.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Brian. And as Brian said, let's start taking a look at the task force side of the ledger and the task force activities to date. And if we move to the next slide, as Brian referenced, the work of the Technology Task Force was really framed out by the Technology Project Phase 1 final report that was delivered to the board in December 19 by the original Technology Working Group that was charged with studying and analyzing the impact of artificial intelligence, big data, and data analytics on the ethical behavior of professional accountants and whether revisions to the code might be necessary to address such behavior. And ultimately, the original Technology Working Group concluded that the current code generally provides principles-based guidance that covers most technology-related ethics issues that professional accountants and public accounting firms might encounter. However, the Technology Working Group did provide, as Brian mentioned, 7 recommendations for potential technology-related revisions to the code to be explored by the board. These recommendations essentially set the scope for the work of the current Technology Task Force, and we'll talk about those recommendations in detail as the program continues. Moving on to the next slide, one of the starting points for the work of that original Technology Working Group was to analyze the code's fundamental principles of integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior, along with the conceptual framework in the code designed to ensure compliance with the fundamental principles through the lens of technology, to be sure that such structure is fit for purpose as it relates to technology-related ethical issues. As the analysis was conducted by the Technology Working Group before even concluded on the sufficiency of the fundamental principles in the conceptual framework, as I mentioned in the last slide, it became apparent that these technology-related ethical issues cut across all of the fundamental principles and the conceptual framework in an interrelated way, such that they must all be considered in a holistic approach when addressing a technology-related ethical behavior situation. The Technology Working Group Phase 1 report illustrates this through the example of the potential for machine bias, where undue reliance on technology-generated outputs could impair the objectivity of the professional accountant. So you've got objectivity fundamental principle. In order to avoid undue reliance, the professional accountant must have the professional competence and due care to understand the outputs and how they were generated. So yet another fundamental principle. If the professional accountant knew that the outputs were biased, but used them anyway, then their integrity could be impaired, the third fundamental principle. Confidentiality is always in play when dealing with tech-driven info, fourth fundamental principle. And then lastly, any lapse in these fundamental principles could discredit the profession, impacting the professional behavior fundamental principle. So through that one example, you can see the interrelated nature of the impact of technology on compliance with the fundamental principles, as well as the conceptual framework. And if we move to the next slide, when the Technology Working Group analyzed whether the fundamental principles were sufficient to address ethical technology-related issues, we looked at a number of AI ethical frameworks from different organizations such as Microsoft, IBM, and even the Australian government. And we identified a number of common principles across those AI ethical frameworks. What we then did was tied those common principles in the ethical frameworks back to the fundamental principles in the code to identify any potential gaps. And the graphic here on the slide depicts that analysis. So starting with the AI ethical principles, the principles from the AI ethical frameworks on the left, we had fairness, which seemed to align to integrity and objectivity. We had transparency, which seemed to align to integrity and confidentiality. We had accountability, which aligned most closely to professional competence and due care and professional behavior. We had explainability, which aligned most closely with integrity and professional competence and due care. Privacy and security, a pretty direct line to confidentiality. growth mindset for a direct connection to professional competence and due care. And then lastly, ethical leadership connecting with professional behavior. So the ultimate conclusion in that phase 1 report was that the code's fundamental principle structure was likely sufficient to address ethical issues arising from technology. However, the conclusion was that there might be ways to better highlight how those fundamental principles would be applied in these technology-related circumstances through revisions to application material in the code or through non-authoritative material outside of the code. And if we move to the next slide, as indicated here on this slide, the Technology Working Group concluded that there were such opportunities for potential highlights or potential code revisions or non-authoritative material in the areas of transparency, accountability, and then privacy and security. And we'll talk about those in more detail shortly. Here on the next slide, we talk about the right mindset or growth mindset and ethical leadership. And again, in addition to those 3 principles on the previous slide related to the AI ethical frameworks, the Technology Working Group also concluded that there were potential opportunities for revisions to the code or non-authoritative material as it relates to the professional accountants having a growth mindset and taking on an even greater role as ethical leaders. And growth mindset is a term that surfaced from research and stakeholder outreach, and it relates to the concept of continual learning and a willingness to embrace the unknowns that accompany change. It's important, if not necessary, for professional accountants to have a growth mindset to keep up with the rapid pace of change in technology and its impact on the professional accountant's work environment. And then we have ethical leadership, and we consistently heard and read about the important role that ethics has as new technologies are developed and deployed, and that suggested to us potentially a higher profile of the ethical leadership role that professional accountants and the profession at large has during times of rapid technological change. So the thought that those 2 concepts could be enhanced in application material directly in the code or potentially through non-authoritative material. So here on slide 15, we have the 7 recommendations that both Brian and I have referenced at this point, and you can see them in a little bit of shorthand. So the first is the critical role, to analyze the critical role of ethics and professional judgment, and that's the recommendation that gets at addressing the potential for a greater ethical leadership role for professional accountants in this environment of change. The second recommendation was dealing with the notion of complexity of the professional environment faced by the professional accountant. Somewhere in the code, particularly as technology creates that an additional layer of complexity to the work being done by professional accountants. Their recommendations 3, 4, and 5, you see transparency, accountability, and privacy and confidentiality, which we mentioned. The 6th recommendation dealt with the enabling competencies and skills needed for the professional accountant to best address the issues, the ethical issues faced when dealing with technology. And then lastly, the 7th recommendation related to independence issues created by technology and technology-related services. So again, the 7 recommendations in those topic areas coming across through the phase 1 report, and we'll spend the next 20 minutes or so unpacking the recommendations and the task force's activities related to those recommendations to date. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off with a look at the ethical leadership recommendation.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, Greg. So we'll hop in here with recommendation 1, and as Greg mentioned, we'll sort of systematically walk through and share some highlights of what our findings were, and then also talk about what the group's plans are with respect to these. Again, just at a high level here. Okay, so in our research on ethical leadership, stakeholders are telling us that as the business world becomes increasingly technology-enabled, data is being used in more ways, systems are becoming more complicated and complex. There's also overlap with other trends, such as climate change and social justice, where the public has high expectations for all organizations and professions to take appropriate action and to be part of the solution. So in this kind of environment, trust becomes even more critically important. Obviously, trust has always been foundational to our profession, but the current situation seems to provide greater opportunities to promote trust through ethical behavior. And stakeholders emphasize to us that there's a real role for CPAs to play in terms of ethical leadership and promoting ethical behavior as an essential, consistent foundation for organizations. And this is especially true as various business processes are augmented or indeed replaced by technologies such as AI and robotic process automation. So this responsibility for the public interest and the opportunity for ethical leadership is something that all PAs need to be thinking about as our organizations face ongoing challenges in navigating change and technology. And again, having ethics standards to rely on for guidance can help us meet those obligations and also to seize opportunities. Within our code, guidance on ethical leadership has been expanded, as Greg mentioned, through those changes that were introduced as part of the Role and Mindset project. That project highlighted, among other things, the need for promoting an ethics-based culture in your organization, for having the courage to take action even when it's difficult to do so, for having an inquiring mind, and also being aware of how bias can negatively impact decision-making. And all of these support critical thinking and professional judgment as ethical leaders. These provisions are coming into effect at the end of 2021. Okay, next, another area that the Tech Initiative has been focused on is the area of complexity and its impact within our professional environment. So a key driver for the complexity that we face today is the underlying interconnectedness of our social, economic, and geopolitical systems. This has been enabled largely by the growth of digitalization and communications technologies that span boundaries. And in today's world, it's impossible to tease apart the impacts of technology and the other societal forces that are shaping our world as professionals. So although this theme of complexity is one that was triggered by our work on technology, it's certainly not limited to just the technology itself. And looking a bit deeper, some of the factors that drive increased complexity in our world relate to the exponential pace of change that's tied to technological advancements, the lack of transparency or explainability of modern systems, especially those that are based on deep learning and complex neural networks, and then the resulting uncertainty, the ambiguity, and the sometimes contradictory forces that result from those changes. And all of those factors play out in the context of resource and capability constraints, often accompanied by increased intensity and time pressure. And if any of that sounds familiar to you in your world, those are also the factors and challenges that we've consistently heard from CPAs in every role during our outreach. And what this means is that the skill set that we use on a daily basis is shifting somewhat to those bigger picture skills like critical thinking and professional judgment and skepticism that we were talking about with respect to ethical leadership. These used to be skills that principally you'd more pull out for strategy sessions, but nowadays it sort of seems like every day includes a bit of a strategy session. In managing complexity, one of the most important things that we can do is to also know what complexity is and what it isn't. And so when we're talking about complexity and its impact on the profession, it's essential that we understand that distinction between complicated and complex. Now, we've come to use those words in daily language fairly interchangeably, but they're not the same concept. And importantly, complex does not just mean more complicated. Complicated problems, so sort of laid it out in the table here, they've got many elements or variables, but the relationships between those variables are relatively predictable. They can be broken down into elements and they can be modeled in a way that leads to reasonable predictions or forecasts of what the likely outcome or result will be because the outcomes are proportionate to the inputs. Complicated problems might very well be difficult or extremely difficult to solve, but once we figure out the solution, the problem remains solved, and we can apply the same reasoning and formulaic approach to solve other similar complicated problems. The results are, for the most part, reducible. So complex problems and systems, on the other hand, these are where factors are not just interconnected, but they're also dynamic and interactive in a way that's difficult or impossible to predict. So we can't easily break them down and use a divide and conquer problem-solving approach. Instead, we have to manage them holistically. small changes in certain of the inputs can have disproportionately large impacts on outputs. And the interactions between elements can lead to unexpected synergies, which means that complex systems can be influenced but not directly controlled, and interventions in one area often lead to unforeseen effects in other areas. So complex problems don't have a single solution, and the outputs are unpredictable, even if we've faced something similar before and were successful. So if you think about activities like strategic planning, or managing a team or a brand, or think about the response to the pandemic, we've got strategies for those different types of activities based on different experience and training, but there's no formula that can simply be followed to produce precise outputs. The strategy needs to be flexible based on the current situation, the perspectives of stakeholders. The outcomes aren't particularly predictable, and at any point, another event or external force can require us to change course. So all of this means that complex situations need to be managed and not solved, and if we try to approach these as if they were complicated by trying to follow established procedures using a more formulaic approach or algorithms, we're not going to reach the best outcomes, and indeed we can end up with some very harmful consequences. Interestingly, other fields in the domains of like science and engineering and medicine regularly differentiate between the complicated and the complex, but it's not something that's seen a lot of attention in our profession as yet. Okay, and then in terms of putting that into the context of our ethics responsibilities, dealing with complex situations poses some new challenges that need to be considered in order to ensure that we're complying with the fundamental principles. And although a common principle that's threatened in this situation is professional competence and due care, illustrating the point that Greg made about the interconnectedness of the principles, other principles can also be threatened, just simply depending on the situation and how the professional accountant is involved in it. So when they're faced with complex situations, what we'd like to see is CPAs be able to identify and differentiate them, for the code to perhaps point out some safeguards, so things like fostering a growth mindset, as was mentioned, ensuring sufficient collaboration between experts, as well as using experimentation and iteration to promote transparency of systems, and assessing the reasonableness of system outputs given the inputs when there is a lack of explainability within the system, and also using emerging technologies like artificial intelligence to help assess the work of systems that are simply too fast for the human brain to keep up with. So to dive a little deeper with stakeholders, the Tech Initiative did a survey on technology and complexity in the professional environment toward the end of last year, and the results reiterated what we've been hearing consistently, that CPAs are experiencing challenges that are related to complexity more than ever before. Also, the vast majority of respondents supported more explicitly incorporating the concept of complexity into the code, and they're also looking for additional resources outside the code to provide some best practices or strategies for helping to manage some of the new challenges they're seeing. Okay, so based on the work to date, the IESBA is evaluating where code changes might help provide additional guidance and where non-authoritative resources might be a helpful approach. Those recent changes, again, that resulted from the Role and Mindset project will also help in that regard, but the task force and working group are both continuing to examine how best to support professional accountants, both inside and outside the code going forward. And if you're interested in seeing resources as they become available, keep an eye on the IESBA Technology Focus page. That's available through the link at the bottom of this slide. And again, you'll get that slide deck within a day, I believe. So, okay, Greg, I'm going to pass back over to you.
Fantastic. Now we're going to speak on transparency, accountability, and confidentiality, recommendations 3 through 5 from that prior slide. And let's start with transparency on the next slide. And transparency is a concept that's already manifested in the code in several places. It's talked about in the fundamental principles of confidentiality and professional competence and due care. And it's also addressed in the code sections on conflicts of interest and most recently in the fees and non-assurance services section of the independence standards that I mentioned at the top of the program. However, as indicated here on the slide, digital transformation has highlighted the importance of trust, leading to a demand by the public for greater transparency in areas such as an entity's dealing with its customers and other contacts like vendors and suppliers, protection of privacy, and the organizational commitment to broader social and environmental considerations. So the task force is considering strengthening the concept of transparency, either in the code or through non-authoritative material, focusing for now on two different levels of transparency. First, where a lack of transparency through omission of information can be deceptive, potentially creating integrity issues. And then second, whether the professional accountant has a responsibility to provide a sufficient level of transparency to maximize the decision utility for users and consumers of the services and the activities provided by the professional accountant. So a couple of different variations of transparency being considered for potential revisions to the code. If we move to the next slide, we'll talk about accountability. And the further reliance on technology like artificial intelligence to assist or augment decision-making by the professional accountant, or even in some cases assuming decision-making entirely, raises the question of the level of accountability on the part of the individual professional accountant for the work, the results, and the decisions generated, at least in part, through the use of technology. So what is the professional accountant's responsibility for understanding the technology being used, or at least understanding the results generated by the technology, and for being able to explain those results and the use of the technology, and then ultimately for taking responsibility for the results? So the task force is considering whether revisions to the code are necessary to address the concepts of accountability when a professional accountant is relying on the use of external experts or intelligent agents in their activities or services. Lastly, on the next slide on confidentiality, the task force is looking at whether the confidentiality fundamental principle, as currently drafted, is fit for purpose, given advancements in the use of technology and data in a professional accountant's activities and services, along with the enhanced public expectation for privacy and security of confidential, personal, and other sensitive information. This is particularly in the wake of recent growth in cyber attacks and other high-profile breaches of data security. In considering whether modernization of the confidentiality, tough for me to say, confidentiality fundamental principle is warranted, the task force is looking at areas such as what constitutes confidential information, what is privacy versus confidentiality, whether the fundamental principle should have a more proactive perspective over protecting confidential data, as opposed to the current posture, which involves simply requirements not to disclose confidential information. So again, changing the obligation of the professional accountant and their organizations around confidential information. And then lastly, how should confidentiality and security be considered when designing data governance processes and setting policies? So again, all concepts that the task force is looking at with the goal of modernizing and bringing into current day and making fit for purpose how that confidentiality, how the requirements of the confidentiality fundamental principle are drafted for professional accountants. So that takes us through recommendations 3 through 5, and I'll throw it back to Brian to tackle the 6th recommendation related to enabling competencies.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Greg. Yeah, so number 6 is enabling competencies. So throughout our outreach, we also heard that although the technical competencies in core areas like accounting, audit, tax, finance, and so on, obviously those remain important, but CPAs also need to have more requisite knowledge about various technologies and their application. So in other words, having at least foundational competence in some of the newer technologies is becoming more core. But an even louder message that we heard is that enabling competencies and skills, or soft skills, if you will, although that always sounds somehow demeaning, particularly given how important they are, these are becoming increasingly important, and that there's a greater need for CPAs to develop these broader professional skills. Different professional bodies refer to them by different names, but what we're talking about here is our ability to apply professional judgment and professional skepticism, to approach situations with an inquiring mind, to be continually learning, which is, of course, why you're all here today. Persuasive communications, appropriate collaboration with others, strong ethical decision-making, all those sorts of skills is what we're talking about. And although these enabling skills are well established in the international education standards, they aren't explicitly referenced in the IESBA code. So in this regard, consideration is being given to the education standards and the related guidance documents that are prepared by IFAC's International Panel on Accountancy Education, especially on professional values, ethics and attitudes, and information and communications technology. And again, this is an important area where guidance outside of the code is going to be useful, and it's already in the works in that way, so that's why at the bottom of the slide there you've got to watch the space again to take you to the technology page. Okay, and I will pass over to Greg now, back for recommendation 7, which is an omnibus recommendation.
Yes, and fantastic. I drew the short straw to talk about independence, which is one of the bigger McGillas here of the 7 recommendations. And if we move to slide 30, the task force is exploring revisions to the independence standards in 4 main areas as suggested in that phase 1 working group report. And you see them here on the slide. The first relates to technology tools used by firms in an audit. The second relates to technology applications sold to audit clients or licensed to audit clients by an audit firm. Third is the provision of technology-related non-assurance services, or NAS, in case I slip into the abbreviation. And then lastly, some modernization of the code's terms and concepts, again, particularly those used in the independence standards. So taking them one at a time, moving to the next slide. Here, this slide deals with technology tools used in audits, and for those technology tools used by firms in the conduct of audits, it was noted in the phase 1 report and by the task force as it conducted activities that there has been a growth in the use of these tools in an effort to improve audit efficiency and audit quality. For example, you think about audit sampling tools and other routines that allow an entire population of transactions to be tested in a short period of time, basically eliminating the need to sample. You might have a fairly binary test that an automated routine or algorithm can run, and you can do that test on an entire year's worth of transactions, avoiding the need to sample and getting down to a greater level of audit precision. And ultimately, as it relates to our bailiwick here with the project, the task force concluded that the use of these audit tools generally do not create independence threats. However, we are mindful that their application could create threats to the other fundamental principles in, with the conduct of audit services. So, for example, the potential for over-reliance on technology-generated outputs as part of an audit could create a threat to objectivity. Now, I will also point out that the IAASB has its own technology working group that's publishing material on the consideration of the use of technology and how it impacts the application of audit standards. So if that's of interest to you, I encourage you to go out and visit the IAASB website and view the page dedicated to the work of that technology working group. If we move to the next slide, the task force is also considering guidance on technology applications sold or licensed to audit clients in a couple of different areas. First, because those sorts of transactions create a business relationship, the task force is considering potential revisions to Section 520 of the code related to business relationships. That section currently has guidance for firms that are purchasing goods and services from an audit client, but not the vice versa situation where it is the firm that is selling or licensing a good or service to an audit client. The task force is also considering guidance on whether the sale or licensing of a technology application could create a close business relationship between the audit firm and the audit client. For example, if the audit client is using the audit firm's technology application as a prominent part of its revenue generating services, that might create a mutuality of interest that could result in a close business relationship, which would then be subject to the requirements of Section 520. The task force is also looking at guidance on close business relationships when the audit firm is acquiring or licensing a technology application from an audit client, again, with the potential for the use of that audit client's technology in the delivery of services by the audit firm, potentially creating a mutuality of interest between those two parties. Task Force is also considering guidance specifying that the sale or licensing of a technology application by the audit firm to an audit client will often result in the delivery of a non-assurance service that must be evaluated for permissibility under Section 600 related to the provision of non-assurance services to audit clients. The idea there is that the application is essentially providing a service to the client, but that service is being delivered by automation rather than through the use of human resources. So if you consider a tax return preparation software that might be licensed by an audit firm to an audit client, it is that application developed by or licensed by the audit firm to the audit client that is doing the tax preparation work rather than a staff. But the concept remains that in some form or fashion, that audit firm is providing a tax preparation service to that audit client. Moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about the provision of technology-related non-assurance services. And the first bullet here on the slide gets at that point from the last slide that I just mentioned, that a non-assurance service can be delivered by the firm's human staff resources, but also by the provision of a technology application to the audit client. In either case, Section 600 on non-assurance services would need to be considered for evaluating the permissibility of non-assurance service. The task force is also considering revisions to Section 606 of the code on information technology system services. And there's two real aspects to those revisions. The first relates to making clarifications to the existing guidance and requirements on system design and implementation services. Some of those potential clarification points came from the comments on the non-assurance service standard exposure draft and were passed on to the technology task force to be considered as part of its work. So think about classifications of what constitutes off-the-shelf software, what constitutes revisions to software that are not considered significant, which is language that is in the current code, Section 606. Secondly, the task force is considering expanding the scope of Section 606 to cover other technology system-related services outside of implementation or design and implementation that are becoming more prevalently delivered by audit firms. And for example, here on the slide, such network maintenance, IT support, help desk support, hosting services, disaster recovery provider or providing disaster recovery services, all technology-related services that are becoming more prevalent in the marketplace, being provided by audit firms, and again, resulting in considerations related to independence. Moving on to the next slide, we have the last of the four areas for independence, and this is the consideration of the modernization of certain terms and concepts used in the independence standards. And there's four bullets here we'll move through fairly quickly. The first is the use of the term office, in particular as used in Section 510 as related to financial interests, and in particular with respect to restrictions on financial interests of partners in the same office as the audit engagement partner. And where used in that section, the focus is on the concept of a geographic office. But today, with the mobility of the workforce given technological advancements, use of a virtual office notion based on service line might be more appropriate in certain cases. This use of a service line notion of office rather than a geographic bricks and mortar office is provided for in the code definition of office, but it's not emphasized in Section 510. So looking at whether there are revisions to that section that might make the consideration of a service line concept of office more prominent. Next, we have the definitions of the terms financial interests and bank and similar institutions. And the task force is looking to make sure that those definitions are still fit for purpose, given the rise of cryptocurrency and their exchanges and the custodial agents that hold that cryptocurrency. And then also other technology-enabled financing and depository sources that are becoming more prevalent with the advent of online financing and depository institutions or online payment transactions in warehouses. Thirdly, the task force is considering whether data should be considered as an asset when considering the custody of assets guidance in Section 350 of the Code. And then lastly, the task force is considering how the routine and mechanical guidance in Section 601 of the Code related to accounting and bookkeeping services should be considered when those accounting and bookkeeping services are automated. Should that automation result in a conclusion that the service is routine and mechanical, or should the underlying nature of that service and the level of professional judgment applied through that automation be considered in determining whether that service is routine and mechanical? The last slide here we have on independence, similar to complexity. The task force also conducted a survey, related to the impact of technology on auditor independence. And the results of the survey were generally supportive of the areas of focus being taken up by the task force and provided the task force with some food for thought as those areas are being considered. So if you're interested in more detail on the survey results, the link to a summary from the March 2021 board meeting is provided here on the slide. But again, some good insights provided through that survey and supporting and affirming the areas of focus that are being taken up by the technology task force. So with that, that I think concludes our update on the task force activities. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brian to pivot us a bit to talk about the current working group activities.
Tremendous. Thanks so much, Greg. The task force activities, as you heard through that update, included some references to various points where we feel that non-authoritative materials can also be introduced in the world, and that's kind of where that bridge is between the two groups. So just looking more specifically then at the working group's activities. So at a glance, the two main branches of our activities are shown here in the two columns. So developing non-authoritative materials and then ongoing research or fact-finding. And so first, with respect to non-authoritative guidance, we've committed to publishing at least 4 pieces of non-authoritative materials throughout the year. We're focusing in on areas where the code already appears to address the contemplated area, but where guidance would be helpful to augment the code or to provide additional relevant context for users or to give some tangible examples of how the code applies. So in other words, we're aiming to help provide some more clarity for situations where the principles-based nature of the code already encapsulates a specific situation or application of technology as it relates to ethical decision-making, but where that might not be immediately obvious to users of the code. So you'll note that the topic areas that are listed in that left-hand column are very broad, so obviously we're narrowing in on specific elements within those areas, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then on the right-hand side, we're also continuing to scan emerging technology applications and use cases to identify and assess their potential impact on the behavior and ethical decision-making of CPAs. And as I mentioned earlier, we did a lot of work evaluating AI early on, but we're taking a more diverse view now. So topics like blockchain, cybersecurity, data governance, so on, are areas that stakeholders continue to suggest to us as being the most important to consider for their potential impact on ethics, other than AI and data analytics, of course, which we still are keeping an eye on because these are also ever evolving. So of course, as CPAs yourselves, these are also areas that should be on your radar too for doing some more continuing education and thinking about where ethics issues might arise. And then when we look at specific technologies, the goal is to harvest actual examples where businesses, governments, firms, other organizations are making use of such technologies or where they're encountering issues in those areas and then considering the current or the potential impact on ethics. And then once again, we're tasked with evaluating whether there might be gaps in the code for which we would recommend changes be considered or whether additional non-authoritative guidance materials seem like they're a better fit. Okay, and then with respect to potential formats of non-authoritative materials that we're thinking about, pretty much anything is on the table. It's dictated primarily by what format appears best suited for the information, the messaging that we're looking to communicate, and to what audience. Probably the most common examples are shown on the slide here, going through the range of text-based documents. Our leaning is toward shorter, more focused pieces that are more likely to be read rather than just end up on a shelf somewhere or occupying some quickly forgotten folder on a hard drive, as the case may be, and also through synchronous or asynchronous multimedia presentations. Importantly, elements like scenarios and illustrative examples, questions to ask when managing technological changes and implementations, and also compiling insights from experienced stakeholders are going to form the core of all of these materials. So you can find these resources through the link that was provided earlier in the handout. That will then, again, take you to a dedicated landing page for the central distribution point or dissemination point for all of these different resources and other related materials. Okay, and then I'll just quickly mention one set of resources that you might be interested in. They're out already. In January, IFAC, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, and CPA Canada issued an exploratory thought piece on ethical leadership in an era of complexity and digital change. Myself and another CPA Canada member co-authored that exploratory paper, and it received contributions from all three bodies that are listed there and also from IESBA. This was followed at the beginning of February by a joint event with a very diverse group of global delegates, and alongside the CEOs of all three sponsoring organizations who kicked off and wrapped up the event. All members of our working group and a couple of task force members either or both presented or participated in the event. And the direct link to the exploratory thought piece, as well as the recording of that event, is provided at the bottom of this slide. And you can also reach here through the dedicated landing page as well. And then with respect to the event recording, I just thought I'd mention that there's a timeline in the YouTube description for that recording if you want to jump to particular parts that really interest you, because it was a relatively long session. Okay, and then next, just in terms of what else is on the go with respect to resources you might find useful as they become available. The first here is the continuation of that IFAC CPA Canada ICAS work. Post-event, CPA Canada is taking the lead on developing a series of 4 thought leadership pieces that are informed by the discussions at the event, as well as some additional broader research and outreach. The first of those on the topic of complexity is currently sitting with the publishing team, so that'll be out very shortly. The second is in the works as well. That's in draft stage. It's on ethical leadership with a focus on the challenges and opportunities related to technology in ethical decision making. And then the other 2 papers will follow. One on the concerns around myths and disinformation, which includes highlighting objectivity, the importance of an inquiring mind, and skepticism, as well as on identifying and mitigating bias. And then finally, one on the importance of professional skills, values, attitudes, and ethics that I also referenced earlier, with ties to integrity, professional competence and due care, and professional behavior. Then we've also started talking with a couple of other accountancy organizations about jointly developing topic-specific guidance. So as an example, one area that we're talking with a collaborative partner about is, as one that Greg had brought up, the concept of routine or mechanical, and clarifying what that means and doesn't mean in today's context, where technology can be used to automate tasks. So in effect, making them mechanical, but where there's still professional judgment involved, leading to questions of permissibility of non-assurance services. So obviously that'll be of keen interest to auditors. Next in the pipeline, IESBA is preparing a report to summarize and highlight the feedback on those 2 technology surveys that we've discussed a few times. And then carrying on, there's also a plan to draft a couple of more installments for the very popular and well-received Exploring the IESBA Code series to highlight key aspects of technology-related considerations when applying the code. If you're not familiar with that, the link on the slide will take you there. That 12-part series was developed by IFAC in collaboration with the IESBA to really promote awareness, adoption, and implementation of the code and the independence standards, where each installment focuses on a specific aspect of the code using real-world situations in a way that seems to be relatable and practical and so on. And then finally, the working group has also drafted a briefing note for outreach sessions just to explain the IESBA tech project and help stakeholders consider different aspects that are relevant to them, and sort of lays out in more detail the different topics that we're looking at. Okay, and then just to reiterate, in addition to developing NAM and collaborating with stakeholders, we're continuing our research in a number of important technology areas and related topics, and the working group is going to feed in the results of that on a sort of an ongoing basis to the board and to the task force so that it can form part of the deliberations and is captured appropriately through IESBA's principles-based approach to standard setting. Okay. And with that, we are, of course, over time.
Yeah.
By a minute
no,
and a
that's
half.
okay. Yeah, Brian, it's Greg. I'll step in, give you at least 15 seconds to catch your breath. We do have one question in the chat. We can stay on for a few minutes if people can stay on. So if you do have any other questions, now would be the time to pose them, and we'll tackle as many as we can. But we do have one in the chat, Brian, and it's timely given the last slide that you had as far as future fact-finding for the working group. So I will throw it to you in light of that. And the question is, what role do you think blockchain technologies will have in building trust, transparency, and accountability?
Yeah, and thanks for that. Great question from Dale. Well, inherently, the whole function of blockchain is to help establish trust, right, through technological means to address things like having a strict audit trail around transactions and to have the distribution of the information across multiple partners to again facilitate trust rather than it being in a centralized location and then having questions about the integrity and so on. So I think it's going to have a very significant impact. It is already having a significant impact on trust. It will have a greater impact on our profession. It's going to require some changes and some considerations around audit approach. So I know the IASB is thinking about how this impacts audit processes and procedures and so on. It's all fine and dandy to have something, information on a blockchain and so on, but there can still be integrity questions about the chain itself. There have been different research studies that have shown sort of malicious information that's being injected without end users' knowledge or the partner's knowledge around the injection of that information. It wasn't found until later. So although it's there and the information is shared and it's easy to get to, et cetera, on a public blockchain, things can become challenging as well. So it's not a complete panacea of trust, but again, that's the entire underlying reason d'etre, really, of blockchain is to address those kinds of trust issues. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that continues to play out. Bitcoin and all the rest of it aside, I think there's other applications that are much more interesting and serious on the accounting and auditing side.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Brian. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'll use this as my opportunity to sign off and thank everyone for attending today. Hopefully you found today's presentation to be informative and at least set the foundation for where the IESBA technology project is going. And again, as Brian said, consult our project page on the IESBA website. Keep tabs on us as we approach the exposure draft, looking to be issued by the end of 2021. And again, hopefully this provides you some information that you'll find useful in your day-to-day activities. Brian, before we turn it back to Linda, I'll turn it over to you, see if you have any final comments.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Greg. And yeah, I just really want to reiterate that if folks have comments or questions or what have you, please get in contact with us. The link to the ethics board is shown on this slide. So always interested in hearing from stakeholders. That's really the only way that a global code can work is by hearing from a diverse group of international stakeholders. So always interested in your thoughts. Thank you so much for the question that we did have, but I know there may be other questions. So please let us know, and happy to communicate with folks.
Yes,
and
it is.
Thanks also to
just
CPA Australia.
Oh, for sure, and Kahoot as well. So yes, it is certainly the beginning of our technology journey. So as you do learn more, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to Brian or myself or anyone connected with the project. So with that, Linda, I think I will go ahead and turn it over to you for some closing announcements.
No problems. Thank you. A big thank you there to both Brian and Greg for a fantastic webinar. Special thanks to everyone for your attendance today. That does formally conclude today's webinar, everyone. To exit, please go ahead and click on the X on the top right of your screen, just letting you know upon exiting, you will be automatically redirected to a feedback form. You are initially taken to an external site message. Go ahead and click the blue continue button just to go through to the feedback form. It only takes about 30 seconds to complete. However, it's really beneficial for CPA Australia as well as our panel, so please go ahead and leave us your thoughts. On that note, Greg and Brian, as you can see there's a few thank yous coming through for you in the chat box, so thank you very much. What I'll do now is I'll pop on the music as you all exit. Thank you once again for your attendance today. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.